Hello and welcome to the Rask Network. What you're about to hear and see is limited to general financial information only. Please be sure to speak to your financial planner or refer to our financial services guide available at rask.com.au/FSG before acting on the information.
G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. This is our weekly 2 cents segment with me, Pete Wargent from Alan Wargent Property Buyers, and I'm here with Chris Bates from the Flint Group. G'day, Chris. How's your week been?
Oh, it's been good, Pete. I mean, last week I said I was heading up to sort of Newcastle on the weekend to see my mum's 60th. So that was nice and fun. And my stepdad came out from hospital, which was great. A bit of a funny story though. Friday night was a bit overcooking for the week. So we said, we'll take the kids down to the local Pocket Pizza, which if you're on the beaches, you'll know that it's pretty amazing pizza. And we're sitting there. Firstly, Tommy knocks his glass of water over in 10 seconds and the kids are going a bit feral, and I'm thinking, God, this is an advertisement for not having kids, because there was a couple sitting next to us. And next thing you know, he leans over and says hello, and shout out to Marty and Nolene. They're listeners of the show, and we got into a good chat. So I thought he was looking at me saying, mate, can you keep your kids a bit quiet? But he was wanted to have a chat about 2 cents. So shout out to Marty and Nolene. What's been happening in your world?
It's funny you say that, because having done bits and pieces of media over the years, very occasionally people come up and say hello. But in recent months, I've had that a lot more. Going up to the tennis club or the golf club, people are always saying, "G'day, listen to the show every week." So I haven't looked at listener numbers recently, but clearly, even by virtue of being recognised, or sometimes people even say, "Oh, I recognised your voice," because being a somewhat distinctive English accent. People sort of hear me speak and they go, "Oh, you're the guy from 2 cents." So, look, I haven't looked at the charts or the numbers, but clearly more people are listening. So, do feel free, as long as you're being nice, do feel free to come and say hello if you see me lurking around the Sunshine Coast. Yeah, it's been a cracker of a week up here, actually. So, been down to Springfield to watch the prelim final of the AFL Women's and another grand final appearance for the Lions. And it's just been really good weather on the sunny coast. Everyone's been down at the beach this week. And I guess we're working right up until Christmas, New Year, because we've still got quite a lot of engagements underway in Brisbane and not much in the way of new listings coming on, but we're just picking up the odd off-market property, and the number of buyers is just starting to disperse now because we're heading into December.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think for your end of the transaction, Pete, it's probably slowing down, right? Less properties, less purchases, but it's always an interesting time for us. It changes year to year in December. January is always quite busy for us. A lot of people are getting ready for the next year, and it's always that reset at January 1 where everyone wants to change their life for the better, and property sometimes is a part of that. But I actually find in the last 2 weeks our existing clients coming back and surprising us. Last week was really busy for the team. This week's been really busy as well with new client calls, etc. So there's just always a huge pent-up demand in property markets that, we've always got to remember. It's people that are wanting to enter the market for the first time. It's people in apartments that need houses, or, people who's growing families, and people moving back from overseas that or people are selling out and wanting to do renos and upgrades. So there's just always a desire for, because it's so much driven by owner-occupiers, the market, people are always looking for something that's going to better suit their needs, or they may be doing better financially. They got that promotion, or their business is doing better, and they're like, actually, I really want to upgrade because I want to be in this school zone or whatever it might be. And so, I think that pent-up demand in markets is often forgotten when you sort of, you just sort of watch day to day.
It does feel like it, especially in Sydney, where there's not really that much being built at the moment. And so the market may have softened a bit with bigger auction volumes, but all those people are still out there looking for rentals, looking for a place to live, and the numbers keep on building. And then, construction is just really struggling in that part of the country. So, it could easily be a surprise when we reopen in the new year. Biggest sort of news I was flicking through just yesterday is that APRA made an announcement that they would maintain the lending assessment buffers at 3 percentage points. So basically, in plain English, if you go for a loan today and the mortgage rate is, let's say, 6.5%. The broker and the lender has to run a stress test. This is more your wheelhouse than mine, Chris. But a stress test is run to ensure you can comfortably afford the repayments at 9.5%, which is effectively a mortgage rate you're never going to pay. Did you think that was a surprise, or do you think they're just going to hold these buffers in place until inflation is definitively broken and interest rates are on the way back down?
Yeah, I mean, I think your end of the point there's the right one, right? It doesn't probably make sense to cut it now and give people more capacity when rate cuts aren't here. But I mean, what's interesting here is at least they're communicating that they are holding it and that there's a review of it, right? So I think as people watching the market is to go, well, at some point they're going to do another review. And if the situation in the environment is much more favorable, where rate cuts are happening, inflation is back in the box, and there's which leads into our first story, Pete, around borrowing capacity. And there's a lot of argument that there's a inequality getting pushed. There's going to be a lot of pressure on APRA to reduce the buffer. It doesn't make sense to have such a high buffer in rate cuts happening. So, but it's just interesting that they're reviewing it, right? That just shows that at some point they'll review it again. And it doesn't mean that it's going to be a hold. It could be a cut to the assessment rate. So every 0.5% cut in assessment rate is a 5% increase in borrowing capacity. So a 1% cut is a 10% increase. So I'd be very surprised if they do more than a 1%, but a 10% increase in borrowing capacity could very much, particularly in markets where people are borrowing up to their max, i.e. Sydney and even Brisbane, I would say now. I reckon you could easily see a 10% increase in prices, in correlation to that, give or take, because I think everyone's spending their max. So if you give people an extra 10% borrowing capacity, they'll likely have to spend it.
Yeah, different markets, isn't it? Bank of England, they have a 1 percentage points buffer, but it's a different market over there, different stage of the cycle as well. In Australia, it's 3 percentage points, which feels too high, really. It's shutting out a lot of first-time buyers. I wouldn't be surprised though if it went back to 2.5 percentage points at some point. I'll just read through what the APRA chair, John Lonsdale, said just in brief. If I speak too quickly here, you'll have to put me on 0.75 speed, but I'll just run through it very quickly. Since the last review of settings in July, inflation has continued to moderate, yes. The risk of higher interest rates has receded somewhat. Yes, that's also true. But we're mindful of potential shocks to household incomes from a slowing labour market. Well, I don't know about that. Like the unemployment rate's 4.1%. We've added 400,000 jobs over the past year. So it might be slowing, but it's slowing into record high employment. So anyway, the risk is maybe exacerbated by uncertainty in the global economic environment, including geopolitical instability. I think this is really a smokescreen, because when in history have we ever been able to say that there's no instability globally? There's always something going on. And even if there wasn't, something could come from left field, as it often does. So anyway, credit continues to flow to households, said APRA, and business as well. And also credit is accessible for good quality borrowers. I think this is the crux of the issue. If you earn 250K, or if you've got wealthy parents who can act as guarantors, that's great for you. But what if you're a lower income earner or first home buyer? You're being stress tested for a mortgage rate you're not going to pay, and you're effectively being shut out of the market. So, and just to wrap up on that, house price growth has eased, but prices are still higher than before the pandemic, and household debt is relatively high compared with long-term trends and relative to international peers. So in light of these considerations, APRA maintains its current settings. I think a lot of this stuff is kind of just commentary, because at the end of the day, I think what will happen is once inflation is definitely beaten, then they'll probably go back to a more normal setting. I think they're working in conjunction with the Reserve Bank to try and beat inflation, and a lot of that commentary will dissipate. But to your point, I guess this does show that the settings are being reviewed. There is some pressure from banks, and at some point we'll probably go back towards 2.5 percentage points, which would add a little bit to borrowing capacities next year.
Yeah, I think this leads a little bit into our second story as well, P. We've mentioned around our global, which we mentioned last week. We're probably worthwhile us just talking about a global story as well, because we sometimes forget there's a big world out there, and there's always stuff happening at a global level. And what's happening in Australia, and we're not just the only country in the world facing these challenges. So, I don't know if I mentioned on the podcast last week, but it was just sort of really hit home for me last week when I was chatting to a client. Their incomes were circa almost 250 as a couple. One was in the school, in the education sort of industry. When you looked at what they'd saved up for a deposit, which was really hard with 2 young kids, they just hadn't entered the market, and they needed a 3-bed because they had 2 young kids, and they didn't want to leave too far from the inner west. And when we looked around at what they could buy, it was very slim pickings. And I'm thinking this is going to become more and more of an issue in Sydney unless borrowing capacities go up. But unfortunately, when borrowing capacities go up, prices will go up. So I can't see a solution here. I think Sydney's, put itself in a bit of a hole and cornered itself. It's not building enough. It's got a huge pent-up demand, and there's not enough options for families. And you're going to force the city to have a real identity crisis in the next few years, I feel. And it's not easy to fix it. So, I think the problems of today are only going to get worse tomorrow. So should we crack on with story number 1, Pete?
Yeah, let's do that. So, it's a bit chicken and egg, isn't it? I think you can restrict the access to credit, but that has also knocked building approvals down to the lowest level in a dozen years. Construction is basically stalled in Sydney. So, household debt levels might be high, but if you knock people out of the market, well, that's not going to help new supply either. So, it goes round in a circle a little bit. So, first story of the week in the Fin Review, 2 tweaks would let first home buyers borrow more. So this is one potential solution, is to change the borrowing capacity rules, but maybe just change it for first home buyers and not for every buyer in the market. So there's a couple of things. One is serviceability buffers that we already mentioned. The other thing as well that does hold a lot of first home buyers back is in Australia, a lot of people will graduate with HECS debt or tuition debt. And then if that counts against them on their borrowing capacity, it's very difficult then for a first home buyer to compete with an older investor or maybe an upgrader because they've got this HECS debt sort of weighing them down and they can't borrow the same amount as they might otherwise be able to do. So I suppose these are a couple of potential changes suggested by National Australia Bank. I think this shows that banks are looking for ways to lend more, something you touched on last week, potentially a bit of a mortgage war thing happening next year, and they're getting a bit more vocal as well. And I suppose it just feeds back into this sort of debate between our policymakers trying to tackle affordability or politicians trying to tackle home ownership, because sometimes adding these sort of demand size decide measures, yes, it could increase the home ownership rate, but it also increases demand. So but did you think there were sensible suggestions from NAB?
Yeah, so Albo was talking about cutting, HECS just recently, 20%. We've seen some policies. HECS has become a real issue in the last few years with borrowing capacity, and it's really getting looked at now, and it's really hurting people's borrowing capacity. I mean, I was chatting to Scott Pape a few weeks ago. We used to talk all the time. I haven't chatted to him for a few years, but he gave me a bell just to talk about an article he's doing around HECS. And we're just discussing how much it affects people's borrowing capacity. And and because university costs have just been so much over the last decade or so, people have got quite large HECS bills and they've got to pay back. So it's quite a big issue. I mean, I can see all sorts of things coming out for first home buyers. I can see an expansion of the 5% deposit scheme. I can see more and more stamp duty exemptions coming in for first home buyers. I can see longer loans. And maybe they remove HECS. Maybe there's not a much lower assessment buffer for them. So, but I think, there's a lot of incentive to try to help more first home buyers into the market. But when you're increasing demand and you're not increasing supply, and also you're increasing people's borrowing capacity, most first home buyers shop in the same area. And so all you're going to do is increase people's budget in a small postcode, and then push prices up, and then all those first home buyers that miss out are going to go to the next postcode together, and then they're going to push that price up. So whether it really helps them, I don't know. But I do think, maybe that Dominic Perrottet, no stamp duty or land tax for first home buyers, I think that could be a policy that we might see come back in the coming years. But obviously you can see that there is a desire to increase borrowing capacities for the one part of the market that'll probably be affected the most is first home buyers. But if you solve the problem for people today, you're really solving it for the kids that are 15, or are you just pushing up, kicking the can down the road. And that's probably the real issue here is that, you can win some votes and help people today, but I don't think you're solving the system's flaws.
I think for first-time buyers, it's part of a much bigger conversation about cash flow management. And you mentioned Scott Pape there. I've recommended so many people over the years to get, if they're not sort of from a financially literate background, get your hands on a copy of The Barefoot Investor, and also there's a book for families there because, managing personal credit cards and debt and HEX there is all part of that journey to first home ownership. Yes, it's a difficult environment at the moment. Economist Peter Tulip of the CIS says restrictions on housing finance, I'm quoting from the article now, have made home loans the preserve of the rich, noting CBA data shows the share of loans going to borrowers earning more than 200k has doubled since 2018, while those going to borrowers on less than 100k is nearly halved. So he's saying the interest rate buffer is too wide, basically. And look, I tend to agree. I mean, I think back to when we were doing seeing a lot of loans where people were being tested for their expenses. But what sort of that overlooks is that thinking back to when I bought my first home, my expenditure was very different before I bought it to after the purchase. Of course, once you're on the housing ladder, you'll do whatever you can and whatever it takes to keep making those mortgage repayments. And you might be going out 5 nights a week before you buy the property. But then, of course, once you've got a mortgage, you have to make that commitment. And Peter Tulip says that borrowers generally near the threshold for substantial defaults at around a 4 percentage point increase in mortgage rates, which, let's face it, we're not going to see in the currency environment. So it doesn't really make sense to run these really aggressive stress tests. But it just feels to me like APRA is what they're trying to see is core inflation back in the band, interest rates comfortably on the way back down, and then they'll probably release the handbrake a little bit.
Yeah, so if you haven't heard of Peter Tulip before, he's a very smart chap. He used to work at the RBA and I think also the Federal Reserve over in the US. I've interviewed him a couple of times on the Elephant, and he's a good guy. He's a big fan of the YIMBY movement, which is yes in my backyard, not no in my backyard for the NIMBYs, and very pro zoning and supply. And he's very vocal. He's very research backed as well. So shout out to Peter. He's one of the good guys, I'd say, out there that is actually creating a different noise out there rather than the noise that you read in the papers. And so, but yeah, this is a demand push though. Saying it's too wide, but that's only going to end one way when you cut that serviceability buffer. So, but yeah, I think that they've got to do something to, give more borrowing capacity to medium and lower incomes. But at the same time, I think you're going to see prices increasing. So should we go to the global story now, Pete?
Yes, we did sort of mention last week that we'd take a look at the global situation for real estate. Of course, we mainly focus on the Australian property podcast and what's happening down under. But I guess a lot of the issues that we face in Australia are being replicated all over the world, not least in countries like New Zealand, in Auckland, or Canada and UK and US. So I suppose we took a look at the UBS Global Bubble Risk Report. So this is a month or two old now, and we'll link to it in the show notes. I think there's a couple of takeaways here. Firstly, in a lot of markets now, real housing prices, after accounting for inflation, are quite a bit lower than they were, I suppose, in 2022, partly because of high inflation, but also I think a number of markets have peaked out or eased a little bit. I think a couple of the key takeaways. One is that there's housing shortages all over the place. We sort of tend to assume this is a kind of an Australia problem, but it's actually happening in a lot of global markets. Construction costs have ballooned over the past 4 years. Higher interest rates have curtailed construction. But I think bubble risks, although they do exist, they're probably lower than they were. Housing shortages is one of the reasons. I think as well, lower interest rates are now in sight. So yes, and in Australia, although there was some moderate risk recorded for Sydney, generally it's kind of moved down the list a little bit. It's interesting. I was in Los Angeles just a few weeks back, and as I tend to, sort of chewing the Uber drivers' ears off and just chatting about what's going on. And of course, housing always comes up in those conversations. And LA was actually number 4 on the list. Miami was number 1. for bubble risks. And I think, what they were saying to me there is that, look, nobody even looks at properties under 800,000 US because they'd be unlivable. And that's coming from the sort of Uber drivers who are not necessarily working full time. And yeah, even just looking around the sort of suburbs of LA, I mean, the types of property that you would want to live in, they're extremely expensive. And yes, incomes might be relatively high in LA, but I think we have a tendency to think, oh, Australia's an outlier and it's got major issues. But yeah, I guess it depends where you're looking in other parts of the world. Certainly some parts of the US, like Miami, LA, and a number of other markets over there are pretty frothy. But also if you look around the world, Tokyo, Zurich, Toronto, Geneva, Amsterdam, there's a lot of markets there that are very expensive. And also Boston made the list, which is another city I visited recently. So yeah, what was your take from the report, Chris?
So I think whenever we do talk about the global story, I think it's just a good little reference point to sort of, step away, get a bit bird's eye view at the world. And maybe things aren't so bad in Australia when you look around. And when we look at places like, Singapore, that's a real sort of success story. I think that's an interesting market to sort of analyze. They do lots of things to help first home buyers with giving them properties, etc. So if you're ever interested to know about a model that could work here, that's a model that is worth exploring. But if you go and look at price to income or price to rent in countries around the world, you go, hang on a sec, maybe things aren't that bad in Australia when you look at that. Like you said, the Tokyos and even the Tokyo market. I mean, go look at what happened in the 90s there and that sort of property boom, and it's a very interesting story. But yeah, you can see places like Dubai has gone through the roof in the last couple of years, and Warsaw, and like you said, Miami and Amsterdam, and also the development costs I sort of saw around the world. It's a global, competition for not just talent, right? And it's also a competition for materials, and supply chain issues are still recovering from the COVID days. I read an article this week, and it was from Tim Reardon, and he just made a quote. If you can't get the glue on a building project, that could slow things down. And so you really need accessibility to all the materials to build quite easy with no delays, because as soon as you start missing parts or things that are important for the build, then there's no other substitution, then it can really be quite costly, right? You really need to be able to get access to things easily. So, I do think it's a constant story just to look around the world and go, actually, okay, what we're facing here in Australia, a lot of countries are around the world, and there's structural problems rather than just an Australia problem.
Yeah, if you look at Numbeo and websites like that, you realise that, yes, on a price to income ratio, Sydney and Melbourne are way down the list. Probably they make the top 100 for unaffordable cities, but not much more than that. Just to wrap up from the UBS report, financially affordable living space for skilled services workers is on average lower than in 2021. Current price levels seem far from sustainable in markets with high home ownership rates such as Toronto or Los Angeles. However, a deterioration in affordability doesn't necessarily cause a strong price correction as seen in Sydney, Vancouver and Madrid. They really are basically saying a housing shortage and lower interest rates are going to save the day for a lot of these markets. And that's definitely something we're facing in Australia. We do have a shortage of housing, and interest rates at the moment are probably at the top of the cycle and most likely heading down next year. But it's, I think it's sometimes worth getting a global context. We sometimes see these price to income ratios quoted for Sydney and Melbourne, but of course a lot of people now live in units or duplexes or townhouses, apartments. It's not all just detached houses in the eastern suburbs. So you do need to do a sort of a like for like comparison sometimes and take into account the different dwelling types as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's lots to look at there from a global story. What should we go on to story number 3, Pete?
Yeah, story number 3 is this: the bottom of the cycle for Victoria. I almost didn't know which article to link to here because I've seen that many articles in the past week or two about the state of public finances in Melbourne and Victoria. You could sort of pick any one from a dozen articles or maybe more over the past week or two. The general theme is there's a lot of sort of news flows about Victoria's economic woes. State debt levels have increased a lot since the COVID lockdowns. The household income per capita in Victoria is now lower than Tasmania. Saul Eslake actually did a little report on that. Although I think you could argue, again, you're not really comparing like for like there, because Victoria is a huge state with a massive population and Tasmania isn't. But I think just as a sort of contrarian take, I wonder if this is the bottom of the cycle for sentiment in Victoria. When you see just this glut of articles talking about the end of the world and how Queensland is booming and Victoria is struggling, I've already seen buyers agents and mortgage brokers online sort of running webinars and talking about the value play now being to buy property in Victoria. So I just wonder whether the early adopters are sort of starting to take a look down there now, because some of the other markets have had a good run. Melbourne was the worst performing capital of the major cities in 2024. And I saw Cameron Cusher from REA Group just did a little graphic on X this week on relative affordability of Australia's capital cities versus Sydney. And you can see how Melbourne has improved markedly over recent years. And I think even just that would potentially drive more home buyers and more investors away from the more expensive cities and down towards Melbourne. What do you think?
It's funny you mentioned another chap, Sol Eslake. I've chatted to him a few times. He's I think he's in Tasmania. He's got a farm down there and lives the good life. So it doesn't surprise me that he wants to say that Tasmania is doing a bit better than Victoria. But I mean, ultimately, while the investor market is only a subset, if it starts to get 30, 40 plus of new lending, you're then creating a lot of demand that that demand can start to force prices up, right? Because particularly if the investors go down there and try to enter into the housing market and avoid the apartment market, because the apartment market in Melbourne has been fraught with danger for almost probably 2 decades now. And so, if you see that a lot of investors are going down there and they're going into the housing market, just due to capacity and budget, they're going to go to a few pockets. And so you could easily see that, investor lending being more than 30, 40%, maybe 50, 60, 70% in these areas. And it's not going to create much to see a little bit of an investor boom. And then when you see prices start to run, the owner occupiers say, hang on a sec, if we don't buy, prices are going to start to run on us. So I do think a good, healthy amount of investors entering, is a good thing to drive prices up. You can see that in Adelaide and Perth. You'd have to argue that they've been a huge force in that market in those 2 cities that, together with owner occupiers, who are going, hang on a sec, if we don't upgrade now, when can we upgrade if prices run on us? So, we've spoken about it lots. I do think Melbourne's fundamentals are really strong. Yeah, it's going through a really tough time, but do they survive? And like you said, does consumer confidence start to pick up from here? You can still get into what I would say into aspirational high-income family markets, and at prices that now look quite comparatively to other East Coast locations like Sydney, Brisbane, and you think, hang on a sec, that's a pretty good life. I can get a really good, nice house on a good street, in a suburb close to the city, surrounded by parks and good schools, and easy to get to the city and the airport and the lifestyle benefits of the city and down the coast, and it's still within budget. So I'm very pro Melbourne. I think it's hasn't done much now, probably all the way back to 2017. It's had a pretty slow market, and so I think it's pretty good buying.
I think so. Saul did a piece in the Fin Review, 16 charts to prove how Victoria became a poor state. I'm pretty sure Saul Eslake had a website, Better Call Saul, at some point, and definitely had a podcast of that name. But I think, he shows a lot of things like gross state product is struggling, the state debt has increased, and therefore interest has increased for the government. Household incomes per capita are down. You can go through all of the graphs and charts, and clearly there's been some significant fallout from the pandemic. But I think when it comes to housing markets, you could probably have done this same exercise for Perth, maybe, let's say, 5 years ago, and said, well, look what's happened since the peak of the mining boom. Investment has really struggled. CapEx has struggled. But I think what we should have probably learned over the past decade is certainly at the capital city level, is that relative affordability is everything. And if people see the cheapest mainland capital city at one stage, well, we had Hobart down there, not mainland, but Hobart was the cheapest capital city, and that one boomed. And then Adelaide was relatively cheap, and that boomed. And Perth has now had its go. So I do wonder whether, you can certainly look at some of these graphs and pieces of analysis and say that there's been a difficult time for businesses and cafes and retail in Melbourne and Victoria. But I just wonder whether relative affordability ultimately trumps all that. And if you were taking a decade-long view, I was just chatting to Stuart Weems from Pro Solution this week, and he's definitely of that kind of viewpoint, really. Yes, Melbourne's had a difficult 4 or 5 years, but if you were to take a 10-year view, probably a lot brighter, I would think.
Yeah, it's interesting. The no stamp duty for new apartments, it seems like to be a bit of a winner. And I wonder if we're going to start to see that up in New South Wales as well. Do you basically offer it to everyone, not just first home buyers, and ultimately knowing that the only things that are going to get built and sold are things that are going to suit the downsizer. So basically it's a free win for downsizers, but what you're doing is you're going to get some more stamp duty because you're going to get the upgraders, families trying to upgrade into their homes, right? So once they sell their property, create more listings, I think you're going to create more stamp duty revenue rather than the downsizers just staying there because they don't want to pay the stamp duty on downsizing. And so I think it's a pretty smart policy right now is to offer no stamp duty and take that hit at the state government level, but knowing you're going to get stamp duty when the young family upgrades. And then once they upgrade, you get another transaction because they're out of their house. And then so there's another property on the market. And then there's another property on the market. And so it's all about the multiplier effect. And so I think it's if you're going to start a bit of a chain, you're probably best to start it at the end of the cycle when people are downsizing, knowing that there's going to be multiple transactions that could get created because of that. Have you thought much about that before, Pete?
Well, no, not so much. I know we did sort of think in some detail about Melbourne's policy last week, but it'd be interesting to see if it is replicated elsewhere in the country. So, yeah, I think you definitely, when you get these market cycles of new construction, and I think new construction will definitely pick up next year in most cities, maybe not so much in Sydney, but there's you're diverting some of the borrowers away from the established housing stock. So, yeah, and I think the downsizing, I think we'll probably see some more political moves to try and encourage that. But it's, I think you guys have covered this a lot in some of your interviews over the years with Veronica, thinking more about the demographic shifts. You're probably a step ahead of me on all of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one to watch because, it's a win for the government. The government also wins on the stamp duty, but they make massive taxes through the development process. Lots of reports out there. So it's anywhere from 30 to 60% of the cost of an apartment actually goes in taxes. And when you add it all up, so they're not doing too bad every time as the building boom. And so I think the Victorian government know that. And so why don't they try to create a proper building boom down there to solve some of their issues at an economy level? And I think it's been a smart call, even though you probably wouldn't be the one, buying off the plan is probably, fraught with danger for first home buyers, for investors, etc. And, but if it's targeted at the downsizer market, the ones who probably can most afford to make the biggest financial mistake, right? Because obviously they're only losing their kids' inheritance and maybe they're losing some of their retirement money, but they're not completely butchering their futures, which is what the strategy's been in the past from governments, is offer a lot of first home buyer exemptions for stamp duties and first home grants for first home buyers. And so you really, I think, disservice to, the next generation. And we've been very vocal on that for over a decade, but I think it's a good move given,
Yeah, it's hard to unpick, isn't it, if you get that first step onto the housing ladder wrong. So the main story this week, APRA maintaining the lending assessment buffers, and that seems unlikely to change until interest rates are clearly on the way back down and we've conclusively seen them break the back of inflation. I think it is working to slow inflation, but it's also helped to slow down building approvals to decade lows, and construction just isn't keeping pace. I think I can see why the arguments from a financial stability perspective. But I do also wonder the global experience is if you get shortages of urban housing in the big cities, well, that could actually be it could lead to more volatility and more risks later on as people are priced out. They move out of the cities and it creates this kind of glut of housing and so on. So, yeah, I guess it's a short-term versus medium-term argument. So don't forget you can join us at the Rask Community Forum. That's community.rask.com.au. Come and send us your questions there or join the chat. Not just on property, there's everything there from business to ETFs, stock market investing and everything else on personal finance. And what do you have planned for the weekend, Chris?
I think just a couple of birthday parties. It's and then we've got another basically only 2 more weeks till 2 weekends till we go away. So yeah, just hanging out at home and birthday parties. Nothing too exciting here, Pete. What about you?
Probably watching the AFL. It's down in Melbourne though, so I don't think I'll make the journey this time around. So yeah, probably just a bit of TV. And as you said, we're rapidly approaching December, and I'll be off to Malaysia mid-December. So start to pack my bags fairly soon. So yeah, have a cracking weekend, everyone. Thanks for listening. And yeah, if you do see me down at the beach or the tennis club, come and say hi. Always happy to have a chat. And as always, links in the show notes if you want to get in contact with Chris or I.
Thanks very much. Happy Sunday.
Cheers.
Thanks for watching this video on the Rask Network. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can get videos each and every day on business, finance, investing, and so much more.